There is a shaft cut straight down into the rock beneath Egypt's oldest pyramid, and for 4,500 years, everyone assumed it was a tomb. A vertical pit, deep and dark, dropping into a granite chamber below the largest step pyramid in the world. Archaeologists called it a burial shaft, a place to lower a dead king. But a team of engineers looked at the same shaft and saw something that stopped them cold. The walls were built wrong for a grave. The proportions matched no funeral chamber they had ever measured. What they matched instead was a machine, specifically a piston, a giant one. And when they ran the numbers, the conclusion was almost impossible to accept. The shaft under the step pyramid of Djoser was not built to hold a body. It was built to hold water, rising water, controlled water, water pushing a float upward through solid stone and carrying blocks of the pyramid up with it. The first pyramid in human history may not have been raised by ramps and rope at all. It may have been raised by an elevator, a water elevator, and the engineers who found it published the evidence in one of the most respected scientific journals on Earth. That is the claim that split archaeology in half. And I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets exaggerated online until it turns into fantasy. This is not fantasy. This is a peer-reviewed study, real satellite scans, real underground structures that have been sitting in plain sight for millennia, and a mechanism that, if it is real, means the Egyptians understood hydraulic power more than 4,000 years before we thought anyone did. But there is a problem with the theory too, a serious one. And I am going to show you both sides, because hidden around this pyramid are three separate structures nobody could explain. A giant stone wall in the desert, a trench full of strange compartments, and two shafts that go nowhere. On their own, each one is just a puzzle. But when you line them up, they start to look like the parts of a single machine. And the last piece is the one that changes everything. Let me take you back to what we are actually looking at. The step pyramid of Djoser sits on the Saqqara Plateau, south of Giza. It was built around 2680 BCE for a 3rd dynasty pharaoh named Djoser, and it holds a specific title that matters for this whole story. It is the first. The first colossal stone building in Egypt. The first pyramid ever raised. Before Djoser, kings were buried under low, flat, mud brick platforms. Then, in a single reign, something changed. 6 massive stone tiers stacked on top of each other, rising more than 60 meters into the sky, the tallest structure any human being had ever built at that point in history. The architect gets a name in the records, Imhotep, a man so revered for this achievement that later Egyptians turned him into a god. And here is the question that has haunted engineers for over a century. How? How does a civilization that had never stacked cut stone this high suddenly do it, on the first try, at a scale no one had ever attempted before? This is the detail that gets lost in the tourist version of the story. Djoser's pyramid is not just old. It is the beginning. Scholars describe it as the earliest large-scale cut stone construction made by man. Before it, there was nothing like it anywhere on the planet. And it does not appear as a rough first draft. It arrives carrying 2 enormous innovations at once: the pyramid shape itself, invented here, and the exclusive use of fully dressed, precisely cut stone blocks, invented here too. Millions of stones, extracted, shaped, and stacked with real precision in a single reign by people doing it for the very first time. There is no learning curve in the archaeological record, no field of smaller practice pyramids where they worked out the mistakes. It appears almost fully formed, as if the knowledge arrived complete. And for decades, the answer to how was simple and human: ramps. Thousands of workers, rope and muscle and time, organized under the genius of Imhotep. That answer is still the mainstream one, and it may well be right, but it has always had a gap in the middle of it, a gap where the details of exactly how you lift the stone should be. And a team of French engineers decided to walk straight into that gap and see what was hiding there. The study came out on August 5th, 2024, published in the journal PLOS One. The lead author is Dr. Xavier Landreau from a Paris research institute called Paléotechnique that studies ancient technologies. And his team did not start inside the pyramid. They started with the landscape around it, mapping the ancient watersheds using satellite radar imagery, tracing where water would have flowed across the plateau thousands of years ago. And the first thing they noticed is a structure that has confused Egyptologists for as long as anyone has studied Saqqara. It sits west of the pyramid, a gigantic rectangular enclosure of stone, one of the oldest massive stone structures in all of Egypt. Its name is the Gizr El Mudir, and nobody has ever known what it was for. It is too big to be decorative. It has no obvious religious function. It just sits there, an enormous stone box in the desert, older than the pyramid it stands beside. For generations, it was filed under unexplained, but the engineers looked at its position, its shape, and the way the land slopes around it, and they saw something no Egyptologist had proposed. They saw a dam, not a wall, a check dam. A structure built specifically to trap water and sediment as it rushed down from the higher ground to the west. And this is where the reframe begins, because the phrase unexplained enclosure suddenly stops meaning mystery and starts meaning infrastructure. To see it, the team had to stop looking at the pyramid the way tourists do and start looking at it the way a hydrologist looks at a valley. They pulled satellite radar imagery, overlaid the old excavation reports, and traced the invisible thing that shapes every ancient site, whether we notice it or not. Where the water went, which way the land tilts, where a flood would gather, and where it would drain. And when they mapped that flow across the Saqqara Plateau, the Gizr El Mudir was not sitting in a random spot. It was sitting exactly where you would put a barrier if you wanted to stop water coming down off the western high ground, and hold it in place. The right structure, in the right position, at the right angle to do one specific job. Here is the piece that makes it plausible. The piece most people never learn about ancient Egypt. Around 2680 BCE, the Sahara was not the dead desert it is today. This was the tail end of what climate scientists call the Green Sahara period, when northern Africa got real rainfall, when there was vegetation, when seasonal streams ran across land that is now bone dry. There was an ancient waterway, the Abu Sir Wadi, flowing down from the mountains west of Saqqara, feeding the plateau with runoff that no longer exists. Landreau said something about this era that flips the whole picture upside down. Before the 4th dynasty, he noted, the Egyptians had more problems with floods than with a lack of water. Read that again. We picture Egyptian pyramid builders as tiny figures dragging stone across an endless, blazing, waterless desert. But the people who built the very first pyramid may have been fighting the opposite enemy: too much water. Seasonal torrents rushing down from the west, threatening the site, needing to be caught, tamed, and put to work. And a giant stone dam standing in exactly the path of that water is not an unexplained enclosure anymore. It is the first component of a machine. Catch the flood, hold the water, wait for the next stage. That is the first clue. And on its own, a dam is interesting, but not shocking. Egyptians managed water for farming all the time. The second clue is where it stops looking like agriculture and starts looking like engineering. Because just outside the pyramid, cut into the ground, there is a structure called the dry moat. It wraps around the entire Djoser complex, a deep trench carved into the bedrock. And in its southern section, the moat is not just a ditch. It is divided into a series of deep compartments, one after another, cut in a precise line. For a long time, these were another shrug. Storage? Maybe. Quarrying leftovers? Maybe. But the engineers recognized the layout, because it is a layout we still build today. A settling basin, a retention basin, a purification system. In plain terms, a water treatment facility. Water comes in carrying sand and clay, flows into the first compartment, and the heavy sediment sinks. Then it spills into the next compartment, and more sediment drops out. Compartment after compartment. The water gets cleaner as it moves through. By the time it reaches the end, you have clear, sediment-free water. And that detail is not decorative. It is the whole point. Because if you are going to push water into a machine with a moving float inside it, sand is your enemy. Think about what floodwater actually carries. It comes off the hills thick with sand, silt, and clay, a brown, churning slurry of grit. Pour that straight into a precision mechanism and you destroy it. The grit fouls the moving parts. It jams a piston, it scratches the walls, wears down the seals, packs into every gap, and eventually locks the whole thing solid. Anyone who has ever had sand ruin a machine knows this instinctively. And whoever cut this trench knew it 4,500 years ago. They did not just want water. They wanted clean water, and they engineered the landscape to produce it, staging the flow through basin after basin so the mud had time to fall out before the water moved on. This is not the thinking of people stacking rocks by brute force. This is the thinking of engineers protecting a mechanism they cannot afford to break. And now, look at what you have. Two components sitting in a line pointed at the same target. A dam to catch and store the flood. A treatment plant to strip out the sediment and deliver it clean. The study described these two structures, the GSR El Mudir and the southern section of the dry moat, as working together as a single unified system, one that improves water quality and regulates flow. Not two accidents that happen to sit near each other, one system. And a system implies a purpose. So the question sharpens into something you cannot look away from. What were they cleaning the water for? What was downstream, waiting to be fed? What needed water this badly and this pure that they would build a dam and a filtration plant just to supply it? That brings us to the third clue, and this is the one no one could ever test, because it does not sit out in the desert where you can walk up to it. It sits underneath the pyramid itself, dropping down into the dark. Before I show you what is down there, subscribe to the channel because we chase exactly this kind of buried engineering every single week, and you will not want to miss where this one leads. Now, let me take you down the shaft. Under the step pyramid, and in the complex around it, there are two enormous vertical shafts, one to the north, directly beneath the pyramid, and one to the south. These are not small holes. Each shaft is a square pit roughly 23 feet wide, sinking somewhere between 90 and 98 feet straight down into the bedrock. That is the depth of a 9-story building, cut into solid rock by people who had never built anything this tall above ground either. At the bottom of each sit granite chambers, sealed shut with massive stone plugs. And for the entire 200-year history of Egyptology, the northern shaft, the one directly beneath the pyramid, was understood as one thing and one thing only. The burial shaft, the route down to the king's chamber, the dark heart of the tomb, the reason the whole mountain of stone was raised in the first place. It was so obvious, nobody questioned it. A pyramid is a tomb, and this deep shaft is where the body goes. Case closed. But the engineers refused to take the obvious for granted. They measured the northern shaft against every known Egyptian burial shaft they could find, comparing the proportions, the internal features, the way the walls were cut and finished. And the geometry was wrong. It did not match a tomb the way a tomb should. Something about its dimensions and its construction fit a different function entirely. What it matched when they built the model was a cylinder, a container engineered to hold a rising column of water with a float riding on top of it. The exact shape you would design if you wanted water to lift something heavy straight up. In the careful language of the published paper, the northern shaft's layout is consistent with a hydraulic lift mechanism to transport materials and build the pyramid, not a place to lower the dead, a machine to raise the stone. To test whether the shafts could really work as a machine, the team did something you would not expect from an archaeology study. They rebuilt the entire complex inside a computer, mapping not just the surface landscape, but the underground infrastructure in 3 dimensions, using Unreal Engine, the same game software company's technology behind blockbuster video games. That let them see the whole system at once. The dam, the moat, the trench, the shafts, all connected, and then run water through it virtually. They could test different pathways, raise and lower the levels, and watch how the water would actually behave inside the stone. And in the simulation, the pieces fit together into a working mechanism. Here is how that machine works, if it is real. Clean, sediment-free water, caught by the dam and filtered through the treatment trench, is channeled underground and fed into the base of the northern shaft. As the water pours in, the level inside that deep vertical pit begins to rise. Floating on the surface of that rising water sits a heavy platform, a float, filling the width of the shaft like a piston in a cylinder. You load a block of stone onto the platform at the bottom. You let the water in, and the water does the lifting. The float rises, carrying the stone up through the core of the pyramid, hundreds of pounds of limestone climbing a column of water. When it reaches the height where it is needed, the builders slide the block off the platform and set it into place in the growing structure. Then they let the water drain back out, the float sinks down to the bottom again, and the next block goes on. Up and down. Load, rise, place, drain, repeat. The pyramid growing upward from its own center, one water-lifted stone at a time. The researchers gave this a name that lodges in your head and will not leave. They said the stones were raised from the middle, in volcano fashion, not dragged up a long external ramp under the sun by hundreds of straining men, pushed up through the inside of the monument on the force of rising water. And when they modeled the power of the system, the number they landed on is staggering for something built with copper and rope. The mechanism, they calculated, was capable of raising on the order of 100 tons of stone. A hydraulic elevator running straight up through the heart of the first pyramid ever built by human hands. If that is what the northern shaft really is, then it is not a grave at all. It is the oldest heavy machine on Earth. Now stop and feel the size of that claim. If this is right, it means that the very first monumental stone structure in human history was not just a pile of blocks stacked by muscle. It was a machine with moving parts. A dam, a reservoir, a filtration system, and a hydraulic piston, all working together, engineered by people who left almost no written record of how they did any of it. That is the part that unsettles the experts. We are used to thinking of ancient Egyptians mastering hydraulics for irrigation, digging canals, floating giant stones down the Nile on barges. That is documented, that is accepted. But using water pressure to lift stone vertically inside a building is a completely different level of understanding. The study's own authors put it plainly. The internal architecture of the step pyramid, they wrote, is consistent with a hydraulic elevation mechanism never reported before. Never reported. Not in Egypt, not anywhere, not this early. And that is exactly why the reaction was not celebration. It was a fight. Because here is where it gets strange. When the study came out, it did not quietly enter the record. It detonated. And the resistance to it tells you almost as much as the theory itself. The lead author called it a watershed discovery, said it could completely change the status quo of how the pyramid was built. And the response from parts of the Egyptology world was immediate and sharp. Not because the engineering was obviously wrong, but because of who was making the claim and what it threatened. One of the loudest criticisms from archaeologist Julia Budka at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich cut straight to the heart of it. Her concern was that no Egyptologists or archaeologists were directly involved in the study at all. It was engineers, hydrologists, and material scientists reaching into a field that had been guarded by a different set of experts for 200 years. And there was a second, deeper objection buried in her words. The authors, she pointed out, had even questioned whether the Djoser pyramid was really used as a burial site. That is not a small thing to question. That challenges the entire foundational story of what these structures were for. For 2 centuries, the field has rested on a single sentence. A pyramid is a tomb. If the first pyramid was partly a machine, if that deep shaft was built to move water and stone instead of to receive a body, then the meaning of the oldest pyramid on Earth is suddenly up for debate. You can understand why that lands like a threat rather than a discovery. It is not just a new theory about construction. It is a group of outsiders, engineers, and hydrologists with no formal training in Egyptology, walking into the most guarded field in archaeology and suggesting the experts have been reading the central monument wrong from the beginning. The study itself even admitted the awkward truth that no generally accepted complete model for how any pyramid was built actually exists yet. After all this time, the how is still open. And into that opening, the water theory arrived like a stone dropped in still water. So this is the moment to slow down and be honest with you, because a serious investigation has to separate what the evidence supports from what we simply want to be true. Does this study prove the Egyptians built the first pyramid with a water elevator? No, it does not. It is a hypothesis, an ingenious one, but a contested one, and the objections are real. Egyptologist David Jeffries, a retired senior lecturer at University College London, called it an ingenious solution, and then said the more widely accepted view is still the old one. Ramps and haulage devices, dragging the blocks into place with organized human labor. And other researchers raised harder, more physical problems. A geoarchaeologist at Cambridge, Judith Bunbury, allowed there may have been enough water to support the idea. But an archaeologist at the University of Toronto argued the dam simply could not have held enough water from occasional desert rain to keep a hydraulic system running. And a scholar from the University of Warsaw, Kamil Karaszkiewicz, raised maybe the most grounded objection of all. The stones in Djoser's pyramid are not the giants of the later Giza pyramids. They average around 300 kilograms each, roughly 660 pounds. Smaller, lighter, easier to move by hand, and his point lands hard. To build the hydraulic device the model proposes, he argued, would take far more effort than simply moving those blocks with manpower. Why build a complicated machine to lift a stone 2 men could carry? On top of all that, the proposed ancient lake west of the pyramid is not mentioned in a single surviving Egyptian text. It may never have existed at all. Those are strong arguments, and I am not going to wave them away. But here is the thing that keeps this story alive, even after you grant every objection. The structures are still there. The dam is real. The geyser, El Mudir, is a genuine, unexplained, massive stone enclosure that has never had a satisfying purpose. The dry moat, with its strange line of compartments, is real, cut into the bedrock, and it genuinely does resemble a settling and filtration system. The 2 deep shafts are real. Even the study's fiercest critics do not deny that these things exist. They deny the interpretation, the machine. And the researchers were never as extreme as the headlines made them sound. They openly said that ramps and other methods were probably used too, that the hydraulic lift would have helped the process when there was enough water, working alongside the muscle, not replacing it. The debate is not whether these structures exist. It is what they were for. And nobody on either side has proven it. So think about where that actually leaves us, because even the careful, grounded version of this story is extraordinary. Strip away the wildest reading, say the water elevator is only partly right, or only worked seasonally, or only assisted a workforce that still hauled stone the old way. You are still left with this. The people who built the first pyramid on Earth understood their landscape well enough to catch and store floodwater with a purpose-built dam. They understood sediment well enough to build a multi-stage filtration trench to clean that water. They cut 2 shafts nearly 100 feet into solid rock with a precision that still makes engineers pause. And they did all of it at the very beginning, on the first attempt, with copper tools and rope and human hands, leaving almost no manual behind. Whether or not the water ever lifted a single stone, the sophistication sitting around this pyramid is real, and it is far beyond what the picture of primitive ramp builders allows. And if the water did lift the stones, if Landro's team is right, then the history of engineering has a missing chapter. It would mean hydraulic power, real controlled hydraulic power, was invented not in the industrial age, not by the Greeks or the Romans, but by the builders of Saqqara 4,500 years ago, and then somehow lost. Used once on the first pyramid and never clearly recorded again. And that is the final, unanswered question, the one that hangs over the whole plateau. If the machine was real, where did it go? Why does the water elevator appear at the very first pyramid and then vanish from the record, while later pyramids seem to lean back toward ramps and muscle? Did the knowledge die with Imhotep? Or are we still misreading these structures, and the truth is stranger than either side has guessed? The study called for more research at the shaft and admitted a frustrating limit. Nobody even knows for certain how high the northern shaft originally rose, because it is only partially excavated. The top of the machine, if it was a machine, is gone. We are staring at the bottom of something and trying to imagine the rest. The shafts are still there, cut deep into the rock beneath the oldest pyramid in the world. The granite chambers at the bottom are still sealed with their massive stone plugs. The dam still sits in the desert to the west, and the strange line of compartments still runs through the dry moat, doing nothing, explaining nothing, waiting. 4,500 years ago, someone stood on this plateau and moved the first great stone into the sky, and we still cannot agree on how. The evidence is carved into the ground in plain sight, and it has kept its answer this long. If you want to see what other machines have been pulled out of the dark inside the world's most ancient sites, the next investigation is already waiting for you on screen right now. Watch it and keep going, because the deeper you look, the less finished this story becomes.